Thank you very much. It's great to be here. I am everybody seems to disclose stuff. I, many years ago, worked for a short time at Microsoft Research. I use Google products all the time. And a few weeks ago, I was the first economist to appear in an Apple keynote. So there's all my biases. So what I'm talking about today is personal data and competition. And I think Emilio Carvano correctly anticipated what the role of this talk is, because I now look at it, having sat through the last 2 days, as summarizing and giving clarity to everything that has gone thus far, because I think this actually is the sort of synthetic issue here. So this talk is, there are issues we know with personal data, ownerships and rights. But that's not what this talk is going to focus on. Instead, I'm going to focus on the competition issues associated with personal data. And those things have actually come to the fore recently through various statements from some of the biggest tech companies. For instance, Larry Page recently said, "I'm very worried that with internet privacy, we're doing the same thing that we're doing with medical records. We're throwing out the baby with the bathwater. We're not thinking about the tremendous good that can come from people sharing the right information with the right people in the right ways." And you can contrast that with a recent statement by Tim Cook. "Our business model is very straightforward. We sell great products. We don't build a profile based on your email content or web browsing habits to sell to advertisers. We don't monetize the information you store on your iPhone or in iCloud. And we don't read your email or your messages to get information to market to you. Our software and services are designed to make our devices better, plain and simple." Now, actually, on the while the rhetoric is dramatically different there, I'm going to argue here that there's actually not that big a gulf between Google and Apple with regard to their attitude towards personal data, actually. But nonetheless, this is clearly an issue that they're happy, even in the rhetoric, to start using for competitive advantage, which also makes it interesting. Now, the way I want to approach personal data from a way that doesn't often happen. There has been a literature on privacy and competitive advantage and privacy and impacts on market power. And they've been very much the standard I/O response. Basically, the notion is, for instance, that consumers have to give their personal data to firms, but they dislike that entire process, so there's a trade-off in that. And how does competition impact on the requirements firms have for personal data and how they disclose it and give it to other people? And there's a literature about that. And there's a literature also about, if you regulate to stop the collection of personal data, does it impact adversely on small firms with respect to large firms? And the answer from the theory is currently yes. Now, the problem with those sorts of perspectives is there's this presumption that people do not like to give anyone their personal data, and there's this innate preference for privacy. But actually, I want to start from a different point. I don't want to decry that, but I want to start from a different point. And start from the point of thinking about product design. Okay? Why are we having this data issue in the first place? It's because there's something going on in the product design process of what these firms are trying to deliver to others. So let me give you a very, very simple model of product design. Okay? It's a very simple model. I know it's late, but hopefully you'll be able to follow it. Step number one is you find out what people want. And step number two is you supply it to them. That's my model of product design. Find out what people want and supply it to them. Now, what's involved in finding out what people want? Well, I believe there are sort of four broad categories of how firms find out what people want. Category number one is imitation. They see that they're buying other products and they say, oh, if those consumers are buying that product, if I supply that product, maybe they'll buy mine. Number two is sampling. They go ask a subset of consumers what products they want, and then they bet on that satisfying a larger market. So think focus groups, for instance. Number 3 is a little different. They throw products out there and see what takes. Okay, and they compare the world with the product, and they compare the world without the product to the world with the product after they've launched it, and they see that they're doing something right. And the final way is to use some form of correlation. Okay, some form of observing behavior, observing people's patterns of demand and correlating it with stuff, and then using the stuff to design products. That's what happens with finding out what people want. In terms of supplying it to them, what we have in terms of supplying to them is basically taking all that information and learning from it. Okay? And that can be an ongoing process as well of continual improvements to products coming from this learning process. Just to give you an example of what, and the learning process can be particular to the individual, and this is where the personal data comes into play. In other words, what you can do is you can design a product that people want, and then you can match it with stuff you've learnt about the people, all the way, you know, if you've got great technology, all the way down to the individual. Okay? So just to see how that works, this is Inbox. Inbox is a product from Google. It's the latest incarnation of Gmail. Not everybody uses it, but Google have been rolling that out over the past 6 months or so. It provides a different way of having email associated with also to-do lists and other things like that, and there's a rationale behind that. Now, this is ordinary, it looks like ordinary Gmail here, but what happens is that Google, of course, reads your mail. And it has learned how to read mail, and it reads your mail and serves out information specific to you. For instance, you'll notice here that it's able to work out that a particular email had something about a meeting and can automatically work out to add that to your calendar and reply to it whether you're going to go or not. That's actually existed for a little while. What's more interesting is stuff like this. Travel. Google has worked out you've just received email from Virgin America, Zipcar and Hertz. And what it has done with that is said, oh, I think you're going on a trip. And it's collected all that trip data in the one thing, including things like check-in, mobile boarding passes, etc. So what it knows is it knows you're going on a trip. It's agglomerated all that information and put it in an easy-to-find tab. Okay? That's what learning about your thing. Previously, you had to find that information. Now Google's learned enough about what that looks like to serve it up to you. Okay? So that's the learning about individuals that can also go into the product design. So basically we have these two things, and I want to focus, of course, because what we're talking about is correlation and learning, because what enables the learning to work is the fact that they've correlated certain sorts of email with the fact that people are going on trips. And now they can recognize that email even if it's not any email they've ever seen before. Of course they haven't. Okay, and so they can serve it up that way. So what they've done, they've used the correlation to develop an algorithm, and we already have heard extensive discussions of this. Okay, so they develop an algorithm by this correlative process, and then to make the product finally kick, they find from individuals data. Okay, they get data from the individuals and the algorithm. And what happens is the full product that I just showed there is a combination of data and algorithm together to yield a product. Okay? So the product design process is one where you take the algorithm and the data to generate a product. And this is why I've gone through this rigmarole of going through these steps, is that sometimes we forget to distinguish between the sorts of data that go into a product. The data that I'm talking about here that learns your attributes and can serve you up personal stuff, well, that is your personal data. That's where that gets input. Okay? And Apple uses that same personal data to do all sorts of things as well. So everybody's using that. The algorithm, on the other hand, is generated by big data. And big data includes a lot of things, but of course it includes many, many rounds and scale of personal data as well. But the big data itself is distinct. In order to make a product that satisfies me, my data doesn't have to be part of the big data, maybe never was, but it has to be combined with the algorithm for it in order to serve up that great product. And where I'm going here is trying to think about the impact of those two processes, of those two issues on competition. Okay. The key insight that I think comes from this, and it was already anticipated by Emilio's talk, thank you, saved me from 4 minutes of explanation of something, is that who the customer is matters for how you match, how you think about the algorithm and how you think about what personal data you use and what you do with it. Who the customer matters. Now, we heard a lot earlier on about two-sided platforms. Do they really matter for each other? Blah, blah, blah. But they do matter for one important thing. In every two-sided platform that I'm aware of, there is usually a group of customers that we'd call the monetization customers, and then there's another group of customers called the referral customers. So for newspapers, okay, we readers, we're the referral customers. We're the ones who the newspaper gets in and can therefore, and we exist, so to refer, so that the monetization customers, the advertisers, can be charged. The better quality of the referral customers, the more monetization revenue you're going to earn, and that has impacts on product design, okay? So similarly, when we're thinking about algorithms and data and personal data and what is collected, we have to ask, who is the product designed for? Okay? So in some situations, as Emilio already said, such as Netflix, products are going to be designed for the marginal customer. Okay? They're going to be designed so we get the customers who are getting the lowest value still consume the service. Now that happens in Netflix because it's a one-size-fits-all product. There's basically a subscription price and everybody pays the same subscription price. Of course, in some products, you have price discrimination. You have different versions of it. And it's how Varian has taught us for many years. Products are designed for the high-margin customers when you've got price discrimination going on. Okay? So we have to distinguish those sorts of things. It can be different depending on whether you've got different versions or what have you, who exactly is the customer the product's being designed for. So the first is dispense distortion. The second is the thing that comes from price discrimination, depending on what's going on. By contrast, there's another group where actually your incentives are to design these things for the average consumer, and by average consumer I mean referral customer, because you're trying to improve them, because you are wanting to sell the data itself. And so if you're designing a product where your revenues are coming from selling the data itself, that is going to be a different target in design. If your monetization customers are data purchasers, you're going to design your product so it satisfies the marginal data purchaser. Okay, and so that's going to give you a different thing that goes on. Now, here's the next part, which is a little bit more of an extreme statement for a Sunday afternoon. What are we? Friday afternoon? I don't even know. It's Tuesday. This must be Belgium or something. There's going to be distortions, and I'm going to argue, just in general, when you've got products that are targeting the marginal consumer or even the high-margin consumer, you're going to end up having processes that distort the data you collect. You're going to be very interested in the data you collect to serve marginal consumers. You're not going to be as interested in collecting data that is going to serve the average consumer. Okay? By contrast, if you're carrying customers as data buyers, you're going to want to keep that data very pure, but the algorithms are going to be distorted for the opposite reasons, okay? Because you're going to be attracting the marginal data buyer. This might actually become easier if I give you some examples of this, or some asserted examples of this. Just to give you one quote to put it in context. Elon Musk, when he said when he was running PayPal, when he said they had some issues of how do you get people to use that service, and he said, The question is how you give people a reason to keep their money in the system. That's why we created a PayPal debit card. It's a little counterintuitive, but the easier you make it for people to get their money out of PayPal, the less they'll want to do it. Now that doesn't just hold of money, that also holds of personal data. In fact, money is just personal data. It's just stuff of what you have in a ledger. It's all part of the same thing. People are willing to give their personal data if they can easily grab it out of the system. They're more reluctant to get it if they can get it back. They're more happy to give it if they can get it back. And I think that basically holds true. So what does this mean? So what competition tends to do is it tends to reduce distortion. So if we've got a situation, the Spence intuition held when there's a monopoly, and when there's a monopoly you design to the marginal consumer, that's the distortion that occurs. When you get competition, you push all that back, okay? So to forestall entry, incumbents are going to want to restrict access to the elements that are non-distorted. So if they've got algorithms that are universally applicable, they're not going to want to give those away. If they've got data that's very, very pure and can be used by a lot of people, they actually won't want to give that away either. So that's where it's going to be the focus of how you capture things. So incumbents selling data will want to restrict data. Incumbents not selling data will want to restrict algorithms. Okay, so let's have some examples. We talked earlier, Michael talked about credit cards companies. Credit card companies do not restrict aggregated data analysis. In fact, if you look for all the credit card companies, they have a consulting arm that is dedicated towards taking their own data and providing insights to business, and they charge for those insights. Okay? And so effectively, they're not restricting this aggregated data analysis, but they will restrict the data flow. You can't just go and get the whole history of everything that American Express has. It's because that's their competitive advantage and they don't want to give it to some other thing. You can aggregate it up slowly if you're like Mint and you can import some stuff, but you can't just get the whole lot of it. Okay? So credit card companies are one example of that, but other tech companies have also done this as well. Basically, there's all sorts of companies now, LinkedIn, Netflix, Twitter and Google and some of its products have restricted the ability to grab whole wads of data out of the system and put them to your own use. One of the interesting things, just to mention off that, in terms of the debate that was going on regarding the scale of Google's data on search queries and how that inputs into their algorithms to serve up better search results. And, you know, is the extra data that Google has over Microsoft worth anything to Google? Well, Google's not giving that away. Okay? There's no sense in which that data is being made available. And as you'll see in a second, Google makes a lot of other data available. So it must be someone is thinking within Google that the data is available. Otherwise, all those search queries and history could be just made public. Okay? Or even with identifiers, anonymous identifiers, it could exist. So I think there is something to that additional value. Okay, so just to be very clear on this, and this is where it sort of comes in between Google and Apple. Services that provide targeted ads are not selling personal data. Okay, services that are providing targeted ads are not selling personal data. So just because I've logged in somewhere and they're serving up an ad that's appropriate for me doesn't mean they've sold my data to anyone. What they've done is give an advertiser access to an algorithm that also accesses my personal data. So what they're selling is this algorithm that allows ads to be matched with people based on session information. It's important to realize that distinction because we fall apart with that when thinking about privacy regulation and other things like that, of whether data is actually being served up. Now, people might find that creepy, but that's another matter. It's not actually a violation of privacy, it's just a thing. Also, it's important to know that one browser can have multiple ad networks, which means that even on, so if I'm doing stuff on a browser, that data can be served up to multiple ad networks to target these things, which gives more competitive options. By contrast, for instance, social networks often just have one. When I'm logged on Facebook and I'm interacting on Facebook, that's it. So if those services have market power, they're going to optimize the consumer product algorithm, but they're going to care less about the quality of the consumer data aggregated, which is part of the reason why that process has struggled in terms of what it's done. Entrants will want access to that algorithm that's been optimized, but they'll only have access to the data. So things like Facebook Connect provide access to the data, but not anything else that Facebook is using to match you to appropriate ads. Okay, let me give another example now of the flip side. Email and calendar services do not restrict individual data flow. Okay, this is something that occurs. But they will restrict access to algorithms. And to give an example of this, let's go to Google again. Google's Gmail service is completely open with regard to your data. Okay? You can take all of your email, all of it, whatever, 12 gigabytes, whatever you happen to have of email, and you can export it and import it to other services. In fact, for Outlook.com, you can literally go to Outlook.com and it will take your entire history of your personal data. So that means that anyone providing email services is not facing a barrier because the history of your email is stored somewhere else. Unlike the history, your browser history, which is a different matter. So it depends on the products. Now, this is a fantastic thing in terms of competition because what it allows is an innovation to occur in algorithms. In other words, Google aren't telling you how they sort stuff, how they do search queries and other things on your own email, how they do that thing with the travel. But that doesn't stop other people using that data and using that ability to access that data, even if it's on Google's service, to do things. Let me give you an example. This is a service called Sane Later. Sane Later allows you to take an email and put it into something called Sane Black Hole, so you'll never ever have to see it again. Okay? Sane Mail, it's called. Or you can have it come in later. Or you can tag emails that you've sent and you're expecting a reply in 3 days and it'll notify you if you don't get a reply. Right? Gmail can't do that currently. But this service can. But the reason they're allowed to be a service at all is because they have access to your personal data. If they didn't have access to personal data, no service. Another example of that. This is Spark email, an iPhone app. It allows, again, it hangs off of Google, and it allows you to do searches such as attachments from David, real language searches, which are something you can't quite do in Google for that same service. So it allows, again, innovation occurring. Here's another one. This one hangs not off email, but off your calendar. This is Charlie. What Charlie does is it notices in your calendar that you've got a meeting with various people, and it finds on the internet and through, if you know them on LinkedIn and other things like that, briefings on them, so you can work out who you're meeting with. For an academic, this is glorious, because usually it's just finding out whether I actually knew the person before or met with them previously, which is often good to know, but there's other things as well. Again, that is because Google's calendar data, personal data, is freely available. So now I have an incentive to give my personal data to Google because they let people take it out with my permission. Okay, and that is entry promoting in that instance. So, where are we in all this? And I don't want to tax you too much for the last session. The issues we worry about are issues of entry barriers. Okay. For instance, as was heard here, we've got the use of scale to develop better algorithms. Okay? That may be an issue. But remember, the reason why it's an issue is because the algorithms arising from the history of data are better. The only way that would be solved is if somebody entrant had access to exactly the same population history of data than the firm. And it's not clear you want to give that, and there's all sorts of issues there. But we have to ask ourselves, if we're going to say that Google has a scale because of its data, that doesn't necessarily follow that it has to open it all up. Okay? But in other instances, they choose to do that. Another entry barrier comes from switching costs and personal data history. Okay? Now, we've seen in some situations you can take your personal data, you can use it to support an entrant very freely, even if you've used it and collected it on another system, as we will often be doing. But there are all sorts of things where it's much harder to do that, and they get locked down. For instance, when I'm switching from American Express to MasterCard, one of the reasons MasterCard doesn't bid enough for me is because they're not getting my whole history of data. In fact, you'll notice that in any of these systems, it's curious. You can often search online for the last 6 months of your data and that can be pulled into a service, but everything else goes to PDF and gets harder, all your previous statements. They're just stopping those patterns going on. Okay, so that's much harder because basically they can only get your future data. This is the same thing with Netflix or with Spotify. Emilio, again, who had an insight into this the other day, he said he's not switching to Apple Music. Why? Because he's already set up his playlists and likes and all this stuff in Spotify. So his personal data is in Spotify, and so he doesn't want to switch to Apple because he would like to tell Apple what he's been telling Spotify for years, but Apple are late to the game. Okay, so that's a very different sort of thing, these switching costs. Now, I must admit, as an IO economist for years, I've been very sensitive to switching costs as softening competition. And I sort of, if I were going to focus on a privacy issue, it's not on privacy per se, but it is the right to collect back data you're giving to firms. And if some of that data is all the search queries you've done or whatever, that would be part of it. Because I kind of think there's not much cause for raising switching costs. I can see a cause for using scale and developing algorithms and those being a bit proprietary, but switching costs I think are a different sort of matter. But that's my particular bias, and reasonable people can argue. There are some glimmers of hope in all this that suggest that maybe we're not in dire straits yet, locked into some large web companies, even with all this stuff. And the glimmers of hope are, first of all, data becomes stale. My own data becomes stale. So it's not necessarily that there's advantage to knowing what I did in 2005 for what I'm going to do and what's going to be useful today. Okay, so stale data is something that's going to free it up, and also gives the potential for people to, as machine learning improves, to learn even if they enter late to catch up with some of these things. Another issue is the issue of data errors. It's not as easy as it was. You can collect data from people, from sources, but when you're using that personal data to form their products, data errors become a more serious matter, because it's right, there's two things going into a product. There's the corpus of the knowledge of everybody else's data, and then it's matched with yours. If yours is a little bit crappy, you're going to get crappy results served up. So data errors, and for that, tech companies, to solve that, are going to need the cooperation of users, because they're going to want users to spend a bit of time investing in their own data to make sure it's error-free. Okay, and that's a whole other matter, but that may precipitate certain things about rights and what's going to encourage that investment. And finally, there are issues of selection effects. And this is where I don't have it all sorted out how this would work, but basically the issue is, when competitors come into the market, they're going to be able to attract not the average consumer, but some sort of marginal consumer. Well, it may turn out that they're already collecting, from a result of that, the consumers that have been most valuable to the previous firms in the product design process. So there may be some options through selection effects and through competition that may give more of a leg up to entrance. Now, it could go the other way as well. But this is something we would have to pay attention to here in thinking about the impact of competition in these settings. So in summary, basically what I want to encourage people to do is to look at product design process far more carefully in thinking about all of these individual products that are being, where we're having competition concerns with. Where is the comparative advantage or the market power resting in algorithms? Where might it be resting in switching costs from personal data? And what barriers might an entrant face with those? And part of that will be working back to see whether firms who had initially market power had distorted their products in certain ways, and what that provided for entrants. And I think that is still all to be done. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to think about it.